talk about the ongoing validity of the law, one thing that inevitably comes up is the need to read Paul's letters. It's assumed that Paul taught that the law was abolished. Also, Paul is usually credited as creating Christianity, the new religion distinct from the old religion of Judaism. Any way you look at it, there are a lot of opinions about Paul and what he stood for. But to know the true Paul, Shaul of Tarsus, we'll have to look a little closer. Firstly, Paul, whose Hebrew name was Saul, was thoroughly Jewish in every respect. As he said himself in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5, that he was circumcised on the 8th day of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, and as to the Torah, a Pharisee. In Acts 22, verse 3, Paul said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, meaning Jerusalem, under Gamaliel, strictly according to the Torah of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you all are today. It is true that Paul did not boast about or rely on his Jewish status for right standing with God, as it says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 8, I count all things to be loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing the Messiah Jesus my Lord. This does not mean, however, that Paul considered being Jewish a negative. Indeed, as he said in Romans chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, being Jewish is advantageous in every way. Paul did not think that the Jewish people were no longer God's people. In fact, Paul specifically asked in Romans chapter 11, verse 1, has God rejected his people? His response was, may it never be. The reason why he was confident God hadn't rejected the Jewish people is because there's always a remnant among the Jewish people who stay faithful to God. He went on to say in that verse, for I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin, meaning he was a part of that faithful remnant. It is true that Paul was a champion of Gentile believers, but not at the expense of the Jewish people. He said in Romans 11, chapter 17 to 18, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive, referring to the Gentiles, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. From Paul's perspective, the coming of the Messiah did not change how God views Israel and the covenants he made with her. In fact, Paul said in Romans 11, verse 26, that one day all Israel would be saved. And this is based on the fact that God promises to make a new covenant with Israel. You can look at Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 34, and Ezekiel 36, verses 24 to 32 for more. As we read earlier, Paul considered himself to be fully Torah observant, and we see this in the book of Acts. Firstly, Paul kept the Sabbath and attended synagogue on the Sabbath, as it says in Acts chapter 17, verses 1 to 2. They came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, and according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures. And in Acts chapter 13, verses 14 to 15, it says, on the Sabbath day they went into the synagogue and sat down, and it goes on to say that they read from the Torah and the prophets. Additionally, Paul also kept the appointed times. In his letters, he exhorted the believers to observe them as well. In Acts chapter 20, verse 16, it says that Paul was hurrying to be in Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. Why would Paul be hurrying to Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost? Well, it's because Shavuot, known here as Pentecost, is one of the 3 festivals that God requires all Jewish males to celebrate in Jerusalem. In 1 Corinthians 5, verses 7 to 8, Paul told the Corinthians, both Jewish and Gentile believers, to clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover, has also been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Indeed, Paul said in Acts chapter 24, verse 14, but this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the Torah and that is written in the prophets. Paul's scriptures were the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, what is unfortunately called the Old Testament. When Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, that all scripture was inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work, he was referring to the Hebrew scriptures. Jacob, better known as James, the brother of Jesus, also provides evidence that Paul observed the Torah. Let's take a quick look at Jacob's words in Acts chapter 21. Jacob, or James, said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the Torah. and they have been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. And all will know that there is nothing to the things which we have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the Torah. If there was ever a time for the believers to expose Paul as not being Torah observant, this was the time. In fact, Paul was willing to prove his allegiance to the Torah by paying the expenses for himself and for 4 other believers that accompanied the sacrifices that were to be offered to complete a vow. Paul obeyed the Torah and expected the readers and hearers of his letter to be Torah observant as well. Let's look at several key verses from his letter to the Romans. Romans chapter 2 verse 13 says, "For it is not the hearers of the Torah who are just before God, but the doers of the Torah will be justified." How does one know if they are justified by God? They will be doers of the Torah, not just hearers. Saving faith should produce obedience to God's commandments. Romans chapter 3 verse 31 says, "Do we nullify the Torah through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the Torah." Romans chapter 8 verses 6 to 7 says, "For the mind set on the flesh is death, but the mind set on the Spirit is life and peace, because the mind set on the flesh is hostile toward God, for it does not subject itself to the Torah of God, for it is not even able to do so." Paul characterized the unbeliever as one who was not able to submit to the Torah of God, as opposed to a believer who lives out the requirement of the Torah because they walk by the Spirit and not the flesh. As it says in Romans 8:4, "So that the requirement of the Torah might be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." Paul's desire was to keep God's Torah because he recognized that it is holy, righteous, and good, as well as spiritual. As he said in Romans chapter 7, verse 22, "I joyfully concur with the Torah of God in the inner man." And again, as he said in Romans chapter 7, verse 12, "So then the Torah is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good." That's pretty clear, and it shows me that when I read those parts of Paul's letters that appear to be anti-Torah, like Galatians, that I have to interpret his words in light of what he said in Romans and how we see he lived his life in the book of Acts. It's true, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, but Paul was certainly not anti-Jewish, nor was he anti-Torah.